Slavery encompassed many aspects of life in the United States during the 1800s. Slaves weren't referred to as humans. They were considered property of wealthy white Southerners. In the year 1776, America declared independence from Britain, and America became a massive slave-owning country. Slaves were important because of the work that they accomplished, but also because of the Three-Fifths Compromise. This compromise counted slaves as 3/5 of a person when the state's population was counted to determine how many congressmen would come from that state. So having slaves meant you had more votes in Congress. They added to the Constitution a 20-year slavery protection. Slavery continued to grow when Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States, increasing land for plantations and also the need for slaves. The Northwest Ordinance created a free zone, but it still allowed Southerners to own slaves. The invention of the cotton gin was an extremely beneficial device, but it also called for more slaves to process the cotton. As historians look back at this time period, it is clear that the United States was 100% dependent on slavery. The War of 1812 was the first war that the new country, America, declared. The cause of the war are not very clear. President James Madison wanted to expand the country into the north, which meant invading Canada, which was a British colony. Others wanted to secure land that America had claimed with the Louisiana Purchase, which meant clearing the Native Americans out of the western land, which led to the Native Americans' removal. Finally, many wanted to kick the British out of the forts in the Northwest land and stop impressments into the British Navy. This war ended up accomplishing little. The British were sent back to Britain without a victory. The Americans began to ponder whether the war was even worth fighting and what it was even about, and the Native Americans were targeted as America's next enemy.
There were many compromises and laws that led to the secession of the South and eventually the Civil War. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 created freedom north of Missouri, which was 3630 on the longitude and latitude lines. The nullification crisis questioned the states' rights versus the federal government power. In 1846, the United States started a war with Mexico because they were hungry for more land that belonged to Mexico. Mexico ended up having to give up Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Wyoming and Colorado. This was the Mexican-American War. The Compromise of 1850 allowed California as a free state in exchange for the fugitive slave law. The abolitionist movement was an extremely influential movement that led to the Civil War and the end of slavery. A number of people chose to tear the nation apart to form a more perfect union, which is exactly what they did. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed the civilians in new territory to vote on whether it should be a free or slave state. This eventually led to Bleeding Kansas. The Dred Scott decision was that all African Americans, whether they were slaves or free, could not be American citizens. The Lincoln-Douglas debate were a series of debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas over slavery between two people competing for a spot in the Senate. All of these series of events led to the presidential election in 1860 of Abraham Lincoln.
Celebrate the election of Abraham Lincoln. South Carolina declares independence. We will We hate Lincoln!
States of Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri are part of the Union. Therefore, I have to be in a balancing act and not show too much sympathy for the slaves since they own slaves.
I agree. You wouldn't want more of the United States succeeding.
Jefferson Davis was a U.S. Senator and representative of Mississippi, where slavery was very popular. Davis was born in Kentucky. He was a farmer boy. He grew up on his older brother's large plantation in Louisiana and in Mississippi. Davis operated a large cotton plantation in Mississippi and owned over 100 slaves. Although he argued against secession in 1858, he believed that each state had an unquestionable right to secede from the Union. Davis was elected president of the Confederacy on November 6, 1861 by Montgomery, Alabama. He was elected to serve a 6-year term, but the war only lasted for 4 years. After the war was ended, Davis was captured by Northern soldiers and was imprisoned for 2 years in Virginia. Once released, he wrote a two-volume book titled The Rise and the Fall of the Confederate Government. It was about his experiences during the wartime, and it was published. Jefferson died on December 6, 1889 in Louisiana.
The Battle of Fort Sumter was the first battle of the Civil War. The battle occurred on April 12, 1861, and lasted 2 days, ending on the 14th. What happened was Confederate troops surrounded a United States military fort on the coast of South Carolina, claiming it was their territory since South Carolina had seceded from the Union like many other states did. What Lincoln did was sign 2 orders at the same time, one ordering the U.S. Powhatan to escort the rations to Fort Sumter to resupply it, and the other to order the U.S. Powhatan to escort the rations to Fort Pickens in Florida and surrender Fort Sumter. When Confederates saw the boat coming towards the coast, they blew up the base. The attack lasted for 36 hours. Luckily, no humans died. Only one war horse died. This attack caused Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina to join the Confederacy.
Confederates marched into Maryland hoping to pick up more men, but they failed in doing so. They scrambled into a trench as the Union Army marched in lines over the hill. The Confederates were outnumbered 2-3 and were getting crushed on the battlefield. Eventually, the Union Army pushed the Confederate Army back to the bridge. The Union soldiers tried unsuccessfully to get across many times, but when they did finally get across and they had the chance to finish off the Confederates, McClellan pulled the army back. The Confederacy was expecting a final attack, but since it never came, they returned to Virginia unharmed. Although neither side officially won the war, the Confederate retreat was enough for Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
Even though McClellan built and upheld the Union Army in its early years, one thing we all know for sure is why McClellan was fired. The reason being that McClellan did not follow through with orders given by Lincoln to finish off the Confederate Army. In 1863, the deal was made and McClellan was fired. McClellan had often not followed through with orders given to him. Some say that Lincoln firing McClellan was for the good. After McClellan was fired, Ulysses S. Grant took the position from 1864 until the end of the war.
You remember my speaking to you of what I allowed, your overcautiousness. Are you not overcautious when you assume that you cannot do what the enemy is constantly doing? Should you not claim to be at least his equal in power and act upon the claim? As I understand, you telegraphed General Maddox that you cannot submerge your army at Winchester unless the railroad goes from Harper's Ferry to that point. But the enemy does now submit his army at Winchester at a distance as great as the railroad. I certainly have to let you go. Best regards, Lincoln.
I cannot express the love and gratitude I bear to you. As an army, you have grown under my care. In you, I have never found doubt or coldness. The battles you have fought under my command will proudly live in our nation's history. The glory you have achieved, our mutual perils and fatigues, the graves of our comrades fallen in battle and by disease, the broken forms of those men whom wounds and sickness has disabled, the strongest associations which can exist among men, unite us still by an indissoluble tie. We shall never be comrades in supporting the Constitution of our country and the nationality of its people.
Whereas on the 22nd day of September, in a year of our Lord 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States, containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the 1st day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free.
The Battle of Gettysburg was the biggest bloodbath in American history. General Lee led the Confederate Army into Pennsylvania to bring the fight to the North. Lee's goal was to destroy the bulk of the Union Army. Lee's army surrounded the Union Army on three sides, so they tried to break the wall of Union soldiers and attack a small group. Although outnumbered, the Union had better weapons and continuously blasted the Confederates with cannons and guns. Once again, the Union had the chance to finish the Confederates off and potentially end the war, but Meade didn't follow through as ordered.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are men on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from those honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
In May and June of 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant's armies joined together to trap a Confederate army under General John Pemberton in Vicksburg, a strong river fortress. After multiple siege opportunities, Vicksburg surrendered on July 4th. The Confederacy was split in half because of the loss of Pemberton's army and the destruction of the vital stronghold.
William Tecumseh Sherman, a famous Union general, is best known for leading 100,000 men into the southern city of Atlanta to conquer it and then on to Savannah. This was known as the March to the Sea. During this march, Sherman had the troops destroy everything that could be used against his army along the way. This was a major blow for the South as he destroyed everything in his path and also took control of Atlanta, which was a major railroad hub, and Savannah, which was a major seaport. During the march, Sherman divided his army into 4 subsections. This allowed the troops to go to different areas where they could take food and supplies from what was available, and it could confuse the Confederacy, who didn't know exactly what was going on.
The presidential election of 1864 was held on November 8, 1864. Republican Abraham Lincoln defeated Democrat George B. McClellan. The United States was still in the middle of a civil war, and it was expected that Lincoln would not win a second term. People within Lincoln's party thought that the emancipation of slaves wasn't happening quickly enough, and many were angry that the war had gone on much longer than expected. Some Northerners who had supported Lincoln in the war were not upset that the war seemed not just to be about preserving the Union, but also about slaves' rights. Secretary of State Salmon P. Chase started a campaign against Lincoln, but that effort died quickly. At the convention in Baltimore, despite many misgivings, Lincoln won the renomination. To try and get the support of pro-war Democrats, Republicans temporarily renamed themselves the National Union Party. They also put Andrew Johnson, a former Democratic senator, on the ticket as vice president. Democrats were divided because all opposed emancipation. Many wanted the war to end and thought some settlement might do that. They nominated George B. McClellan, who had led the Union Army from 1861 to 62 at their convention. In the end, Lincoln won. Just as Lincoln was making great strides to end slavery, his life ended. President Lincoln was shot on April 14, 1865, while attending a play at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln was at the theater with his wife, Mary Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth went into Lincoln's box and shot him in the back of the head and then ran away. Not only did he run away cowardly, but while jumping onto the stage to make his exit, he broke his left ankle. Lincoln was taken to a boarding house, but he could not be saved, and he died the next day. It is said that Booth killed Lincoln because he wanted to support the Confederates, and since the Confederates lost the war, Booth felt killing Lincoln was the only way to try and stop the 13th Amendment from being ratified. He was going to kill Lincoln, and the two other people were going to kill the Secretary of State and Vice President, but neither of them were actually assassinated that night. Booth was eventually captured and killed. All of his conspirators were prosecuted and hanged. One woman named Mary was one of the conspirators, was the first woman to be hung issued by the state. After the Civil War ended and the South surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse, the fight to give former slaves equal rights continued. The 13th Amendment was adopted as part of the Constitution on December 6, 1865, and it made slavery illegal in the United States. Georgia was the 27th state to ratify the amendment and was the last state needed to meet the 3/4 vote for the amendment to become part of the Constitution. The next protection of slaves came with the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, whose goal was to protect the civil rights of freed slaves after the Civil War. This amendment further clarified that the Bill of Rights applied to both the federal government and the state government. In addition, the amendment guaranteed that states couldn't override the rights given by the federal government. The amendment is very long and has many provisions, but the most important one was the one that said that every person, regardless of age, race, religion, etc., would be treated equally by the government. Finally, the amendment stated that slaves would no longer be treated as 3/5 of a person, but instead they would be counted as a whole person. Next came the 15th Amendment that protected the voting rights of all citizens, regardless of race or the color of their skin. This amendment was ratified on February 3, 1870. Unfortunately, this amendment was initially ineffective because people found ways that prohibited slaves from voting, like charging fees to vote that only applied to black people, or making people pass literacy tests to vote.
This new time period, this segregation, it is no better than the last. Slavery is not of the past, but of the present. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were created and passed to protect, yet all it has done is cause chaos. See?
Yes, but look at the good. There are freed slaves who get to live a good life.
They don't live a good life, but they live a better one. Freed slaves are still slaves.
Their life changes when we no longer say that they are freed slaves, but that they are people. That we no longer have to live a day knowing that everyone is not equal. That we citizens wake up to a day knowing that everything is better for everyone, that everyone is equal.
The Reconstruction period was a time when the Americans tried to rebuild the South into land of equality. 1863 to 1877 was the time Reconstruction took place, and it was directed by Congress. Both President Lincoln and President Andrew Johnson were in office during this time. They both wanted to restore the South.
Organization and agency that can help former slaves become citizens. They are still being treated as slaves.
It should be protected by the Union, too.
For recently freed men, we can call it the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yes.
New President of the United States of America for the years 1865 to 1869 is
Andrew Johnson.
President of the United States of America for the years 1869 to 1873 is Ulysses S. Grant.
Even though after the Civil War, African Americans were supposed to become citizens and be treated like the whites, that isn't what happened. When Reconstruction failed and the Tyden-Hayes Compromise occurred, the African American population had to face a new wave of racism. They had to abide by black codes and began to not be able to walk on the streets with whites, ride buses with them, or go to school with them. It can be argued that segregation was slavery by another name. These African Americans had put in chain gangs and be chained and marched like slaves. The Jim Crow laws replicated the slavery by allowing segregation. The Plessy versus Ferguson court case approved this segregate but equaled segregation. Though nobody ended up treating African Americans like equal, instead they discriminated and were prejudiced against them. After the Union won the Civil War, many Southerners were not happy with the outcome and some started terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, aka the KKK. The KKK was a group that wanted white supremacy and many hang/kill African Americans. Not only did they want to kill the black population of the United States, but they wanted to destroy their homes, companies, and everything they had. Oftentimes, when African Americans would show up to vote, their families would find them hanging on a tree the next day. Hundreds of African Americans' children showed up to school and never came home.
We would have loved to say that the Civil War ended in peace and fixed the issue of slavery and mistreatment of African Americans, but that wouldn't be accurate. The African Americans went through over 100 years of segregation after the war. We are very pleased to say that the United States is a much better place now, but we still struggle with many of these moral questions today. Thank you very much for watching our movie. We hope you enjoyed it. Sincerely, Sophie, Story, Nandi, Sarah, Kaya, and Zoe.